So this is a follow-up to a couple of previous videos involving questions on paired passages. One of those videos looked at response questions. Another one looked at agreement questions. Here we're going to have a mix of question types, but maybe a little bit more challenging questions than the ones in those earlier videos. So we'll go ahead and get into it, starting with this question, which asks, based on the text, how would the author of text 2 most likely respond to what certain researchers contend as described in text 1. So we want to begin by reading text 1, make sure we understand what it is that certain researchers contend, and then keep that in mind as we read text 2. So text 1, for decades, historical linguists have debated when and where the Indo-European language family first diverged into distinct branches. Drawing on computer simulations that track shared vocabulary changes across descendant languages, certain researchers contend that this linguistic split began roughly 6,000 years ago in this region, which I could not point to on a map. I could maybe point to the correct hemisphere, but not anything more specific. But the important thing here is that this is what researchers contend. They used these methods and they came to this conclusion. So these computer models suggest a relatively late and rapid spread of Indo-European languages coinciding with patterns of human migration inferred from archaeological evidence. So again, what do certain researchers contend? That the split occurred roughly 6,000 years ago, and that YA stands for years ago, and that is based on computer simulations. Okay, so text 2. Linguist Farah Patel and her colleagues argued that any claims about the divergence of Indo-European languages must ultimately rest on evidence from ancient texts and inscriptions. So right away we might notice one point of disagreement having to do with the kind of evidence. Ancient texts and inscriptions versus computer simulations. But anyway, continuing here, it says that analyzing these documents, the team has identified features indicative of a more gradual separation process that began over 7,000 years ago. They argue that while computer models provide useful approximations, only the textual record can reveal the nuanced evolution of grammatical structures over time. And so we might actually notice three different things here. One of them would be, the time. This is saying that they split about 6,000 years ago. This is saying that they split more than 7,000 years ago. On top of that, this says that the process of separation was gradual. This says that it was rapid. And then finally, in terms of, again, the methods or the kinds of evidence that they're going to prioritize, text 2, or the researchers discussed in text 2, focus on ancient texts as opposed to computer simulations. So really a few different ways that this could go, and we might even see these different aspects combined or mixed up in the different answer choices. So starting with A, it says that they would respond by suggesting that archaeological evidence, when combined with simulations, provides a more accurate timeline than linguistic texts alone. Now that could possibly describe the response of the researchers in text 1 to the work of Patel and her colleagues, but not the other way around, right? Because the ones who are advocating computer simulations are these certain researchers. The ones who are advocating these other methods are Patel and her colleagues. So that is backward, again, in terms of who is responding to whom. B, on the other hand, by challenging the reliance on computer models and asserting that linguistic data from ancient writing points to an earlier and slower divergence, yes. So this really does capture all three aspects. Reliance on computer models, which the researchers referred to in text 1 do, that's something they're going to challenge. They're going to assert that we want to focus on the ancient writings, and if we do so, we're going to find an earlier and more gradual spread. And so that is pretty much a perfect answer here in terms of the response of text 2 to text 1. But let's just go ahead and look at C and D to make sure. So by acknowledging that computer simulations can determine the geographic origin of language families, but not their timeline, Well, this makes a distinction that really isn't there in the passage, in terms of distinguishing the where from the when. This is really focusing more on the when. Even if text 1 says a little bit about the where, the second passage doesn't really focus on the location so much. And then D, by arguing that language evolution is too irregular to be modeled effectively using either archaeological or linguistic evidence. Nope. If that was their argument, they wouldn't be doing what they're doing. And so our answer there is going to be B. And now for a second question, asking what the authors would most likely agree on. And so here, we're going to read the first passage, summarize it in a few words, and then keep that summary in mind as we read the second passage. So here it says, sociolinguist, somebody who studies language and society, I guess, Lena Bay has studied how regional dialects in urban areas evolve in response to social dynamics. In her recent research on speech patterns in rapidly growing cities, she found that younger speakers often adopt distinctive vowel shifts and slang terms not only to mark generational identity, but also to signal contrast with speech patterns of newly arrived migrants. According to her, these linguistic innovations often reflect an effort to create a sense of local belonging. Okay, so here we could say something like linguistic changes, and that's encompassing a couple of things, vowel shifts and slang terms. They have something to do with social belonging. And there is more to it because there are actually two reasons. To mark generational identity, in terms of their age group, fellow young people as opposed to older people, but also to signal contrast with speech patterns of newly arrived migrants. So there are two aspects of that, but as a brief summary, that'll do. And so on to the second passage. Again, keep that in mind as we're reading the second passage. So linguist Marcus Toure argues that linguistic change in urban settings is frequently driven by a desire for social cohesion within peer groups. Well, that's a pretty good match already. So that's something that they agree on, but let's continue here. So his analysis of student conversations in several metropolitan schools revealed that pronunciation quirks and idiomatic expressions are often reinforced through repeated use within tight-knit communities. Such use, he claims, is less about rejecting external groups than it is about building a shared verbal identity. And so here we might notice a point of disagreement between the two. Here it talks about signaling contrast with newly arrived migrants. That would be sort of excluding or rejecting external groups. The second author is disagreeing with that. But again, we're focused on what they would agree on. And I think the key thing there is that idea of social cohesion or belonging. And so on to the answer choices. Regional dialects in cities tend to remain stable unless influenced by outside migration. I don't think either one of them would agree with that necessarily. I would say no, because the emphasis here is on what happens when migration does occur, not what happens in the absence of outside migration. So it's really not the issue. B, linguistic features like pronunciation patterns and idioms can reflect efforts to establish social identity. That works because social identity is another way of saying verbal identity, local belonging, social belonging. It works. It focuses on the things that they agree on, or the main point that they agree on, and doesn't get into the stuff that they would disagree on. C, urban slang becomes standardized as part of national language policy. I don't see anything about language policy in either passage. And then D, young people are more likely than older speakers to mimic the speech patterns of new arrival. If anything, passage 1 is saying that they're less likely because they're trying to signal generational identity, but really it's not comparing young people to older people. And so we don't want to pick an answer choice that isn't supported. And so that's going to lead us back to B. And now one more question. This one actually based on the exact same passage as before, so I'm not going to read it from the beginning, but I will sort of point to what I would focus on given this different prompt here. So this one asks, how would Toure, mentioned in text 2, most likely respond to this interpretation of the speech patterns observed in urban youth. So in this case, what I would do in reading the first passage would be to really zero in on Bayes' interpretation of the speech patterns observed in urban youth, right? Instead of just trying to get the main idea of the passage, as we did in the previous case. So what is that interpretation? So it says here that younger speakers often adopt these vowel shifts and slang terms not only to mark generational identity, but also to signal contrast with the speech patterns of newly arrived migrants. So in other words, there are two different reasons that she cites. And so looking at the second passage, what we would find is that Toure, if that's how you pronounce it, says that it is indeed driven by a desire for social cohesion, as we saw in the previous question. But down here at the bottom, it says that it is less about rejecting external groups than it is about building a shared verbal identity. So he would agree with one part of it, the idea of building a shared identity, whether generational or otherwise, but he would disagree with the part about excluding external groups such as newly arrived migrants. And so, A, by agreeing that social exclusion is the most significant factor, no. So he doesn't agree that it's a significant factor at all. When you see that kind of extreme wording, like the most significant factor, that's usually a sign that you have a wrong answer. B, by arguing that linguistic innovation among youth is primarily driven by geographic mobility. So that's another sort of, I wouldn't call that an extreme word, but an amplifying word. And we just don't see anything to support that. But again, those strong words like primarily or most can be a signal that the answer you're dealing with is probably wrong, because when you have those words, you need extra support, to back those words up. And we just don't have that here. C, by suggesting that speech patterns reflect a desire for in-group connection more than a reaction against outside groups. Exactly, because again, we're talking about building group identity, but not discriminating against or excluding others. D, by claiming that the influence of migrant populations on speech patterns is nothing at all to really support that. So answer here would be C. But again, I think these questions are a little bit more challenging than the ones I went through in the earlier videos. Part 1 on response questions, Part 2 on agreement questions. If you have additional questions about paired passages or types of questions you'd like me to go over, and I can't go over official College Board questions, but I can create new questions that get at certain concepts that you'd like me to get into. So do leave any questions or suggestions in the comments below.